It is my great honor and pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker today, Jane Oakhill. Jane is one of the pioneers of research on reading comprehension, and many of us have learned of reading comprehension difficulties by her works. She is today Professor of Experimental Psychology at the University of Sussex, and since completing her PhD under the supervision of Johnson Bird, she has worked on various research projects, including deductive reasoning in children and adults, circadian variations in human performance, and adult language comprehension. But she has always maintained a strong interest in children's reading comprehension problems, and in particular, she looked deeply at individual differences. Her interest for reading comprehension started at the very beginning of her career, and before dedicating to reading research, she worked briefly as a primary school teacher. That's why she became interested in reading comprehension. And her interest in children reading comprehension problems led her to her PhD on that topic. Since then, her scientific accomplishments have been many. In 1991, she was awarded the British Psychological Society's Perman Medal for outstanding published work in the first decade of her career as a psychologist. More recently, she has been elected to fellowships of the British Psychological Society and the Society for Text and Discourse. Her research has been very prolific, as you know. Jane has published more than 100 papers in peer-reviewed journals, most of them very high-ranked, and she has co-authored and edited several books. Many of us are very familiar to her books, her publications, but one of her most recent publications, Understanding and Teaching Reading Comprehension, on my back, is probably the most relevant for today's talk, as it reflects her interest in the practical and instructional implications of her research work. So, as I said, it is a great pleasure and honor for me to leave the floor to Jane Oakhill.
Thank you very much, Barbara, for that lovely introduction. And hello, everyone, and thank you all for coming. I'm honoured that so many people have turned up for my talk today. So, this is the topic, and as Barbara mentioned, I've been doing this work on and off for a very long time now, since my PhD, and I'm delighted to be able to tell you about some aspects of the research today. So I want to start off, it's difficult with an audience like this, where I imagine that some people know quite a lot about my research and some people know nothing and have come here to find out about it. So it's difficult to kind of produce a talk that's going to be interesting and entertaining for everyone. So I've tried to give you some broad background to start with, and then I'm going to talk about some newer ideas and work for those of you who are perhaps more familiar with my work. Okay, so first of all, I want to talk about what comprehension is, what we mean by comprehension, and the processes that are involved. So, broadly, the outcome of good comprehension is going to be a construction of a coherent and integrated, and those are important qualifiers, coherent and integrated representation of the meaning of the text. And this is variously called a mental model by Johnson Bird, or a situation model by Kinch. Now, I've been particularly interested in the processes. This is all very well, okay, that the end product should be this situation model of the text. But unless we know what the processes involved are and how children get to this integrated, coherent representation, we can't really help them become better comprehenders. So I've been interested to say in the processes that lead to this product. This is really the product of good comprehension, but lots of different things which are, and I'm going to talk about some of them, go into producing that product. I'm just going to focus on some aspects of my research today. I'm not actually going to give precisely the same talk that was in the abstract, because I decided I'd like to present some newer ideas and perhaps get some feedback on those. So I'll be covering much of what's in the abstract, but a little bit differently to advertise. So if anybody wants to leave now, go for it. Okay, so the big question really is, why is it that some young readers and adults, this is not a problem that's confined to children, lots of our undergraduates don't have very good reading comprehension. So why do readers have trouble in achieving this sort of representation? And part of the issue, not the whole issue, but part of the issue that I'm going to focus on today is that they have trouble making inferences from text. This is not the only process that's important, but it's certainly a very important one. Okay, this is really just an overview of the talk to show you where it's going, and I'll come back to this to remind you where we are in the talk. So I'm going to say a little bit about why inferences are important for comprehension, and the problems that we know poor comprehenders have with inferences. I'm going to say a little bit about the direction of causality between inference making and comprehension. I'll come back to why that's an important question when I get to that section. Then, the newer ideas that I'm interested in are the relations between inference making and vocabulary. So the role of inference making and vocabulary acquisition, but also the role of vocabulary in supporting inference making and the production of a coherent representation. And this idea is very closely linked to Perfetti's idea or his theory of lexical quality. And then some conclusions for teaching and remediation. Okay, so I think we all know that in understanding text, we go beyond the literal meaning and fill the gaps with inferences. And I'm just going to show you a couple of examples to get you thinking about inference making and sorts of inferences that we make fairly automatically. Not necessarily. Inference making can be automatic or it can be strategic. Okay? Mostly adults are making inferences without really thinking about them, so they're pretty much automatic. Okay, there's going to be a little bit of audience participation in this talk to make sure that you're all awake. So, short text: the student carelessly threw away a burning cigarette. The fire destroyed many trees on campus. What caused the fire? Oh, don't be shy. The cigarette, okay, so no perverse and obscure answers. So you pretty readily assume, unless you're being particularly difficult, that the fire was caused by this burning cigarette. There's nothing in the text that tells you this is a causal link, but it seems like readers have a drive to make things cohere and find causal temporal links in text if they can. So these are not, you don't treat these as two isolated sentences. You come up with some explanatory reason why you could link them up. Okay. Another very short text. So I want you to think about what your mental representation is of Frida coming bouncing down the stairs. Okay, just imagine Frida coming bouncing down the stairs, and then see, does this fit with your representation? Or maybe this fits with your representation. Okay, so you can see that probably you may, before you saw the second sentence there, you probably made some inference about what it meant that Frida was bouncing down the stairs. Either she was very happy and she was delighted perhaps to see John and it's a very happy situation, or she's actually tumbling down the stairs in an out of control situation. Okay, so very different sorts of inferential processing there. But either way, the interesting thing is that you can connect up that second sentence. When you read the second sentence, whichever version it is, you can find the link to make that cohere with the first sentence, okay, although they're very different sorts of interpretations. All right, just one more little example. Again, a very, very short text. Oh, sorry, I missed it. I think that ice cream vans are fairly universal. I hope so, otherwise you might not understand much of this. So, very short text. Mary heard the ice cream van coming. She remembered her pocket money. She rushed into the house. Okay. Now, what if we had more time and you were willing? It'd be quite interesting at the end of this talk to say to you, remember that little text about Mary in the ice cream van? Can you write it down exactly as you read it? And what I would suspect is that you wouldn't remember it exactly as it's written, unless you cheated and written it down now. You would make elaborations on that text. You would add some of your own knowledge and inferences to it. So if I ask you now, do you think Mary's a girl or a woman? A girl. Why do you think she's a girl? Pocket money, yes, unfortunately. Women don't usually get pocket money, so she's probably a girl. Okay. So use a little bit of background knowledge there, pocket money, to infer that Mary's a girl. Why does she? What does she want to do? Buy ice cream. Okay, it doesn't say that, but you connected this up. Good. You're pretty good comprehenders out there. And why does she rush into the house? The van will drive away, yes. So you have to have this background knowledge about how ice cream vans operate. Okay, they don't sit there half the day waiting for people to come and buy their ice creams. They drive round and usually play annoying tunes, and if they're not doing, no problem then. Okay, so very short, the point that I'm making, very short text, lots of inferences and background knowledge going into understanding just this, 3 sentences. So given that you're putting so much effort and background knowledge into 3 sentences, imagine how much goes into understanding a whole novel. Okay, so the important thing is that inferences help us connect up text, and they help with this coherence and integrating into a whole. An old idea that I'm going to elaborate on a bit here, because it's still very much there in current theories of text understanding, is that comprehension is an integrative and constructive process. This is certainly not new. It dates back to John Bransford, Frank's ideas in the 70s. But these ideas are still current in, for instance, Kinch's construction integration model. Okay. So one issue with inferences is that I want to point out, and I'll come back to this later, is that they're not necessarily all good. So it's not necessarily the more inferences, the better. Inferences can actually mislead us into believing that we've heard or read things that we haven't actually heard or read. So I'll come back to that later. But they're certainly needed for text comprehension. I think that's a very interesting unanswered question, actually, which, if anybody's got any ideas about this, I'd love to hear them, about how we stop making inferences. How we know that we've made just enough inferences to understand a particular text, and we haven't let our inferential machinery go wild, because skilled readers are pretty good inference makers, and nobody's really addressed this issue of how they constrain inferences, except by saying, like as McCoon and Ratcliffe do, that we only make the necessary inferences to understand a text. But I don't think that's it's very circular. Anyway. How we stop making inferences is, I think, almost as important as how we make them and why we make them. Okay, what do we mean by construction and integration then? So what I mean, to be clear about that, is comprehension involves integration between sentences. So if we take this very short text here, there's the words in red, Molly, she, and her mum, all connect up. You could make bridging inferences and realise that she must be the same person as Molly, because you expect this to be a coherent text, not three unrelated sentences. And her mum is Molly's mum. So Molly and she are the same person, and this again refers to Molly's mum. Okay. So bridging inferences to integrate the sentences. And the constructive part is more to do with making the text as a whole cohere and perhaps bringing in some background information to help with that coherence. So same text, but we're focusing on different words in the text now. So Molly was carrying a glass of juice, trips up, floor mop. And I'm deliberately just focusing on these bits without the whole sentences. So what do you think is, what happened to the juice? She spilt it, yes. And why does the mum get a floor mop? Clean it up, yes. She's obviously a very accommodating mother who rushes around clearing up all the mess after her. Okay, and so you don't understand this again as sets of unrelated sentences about Molly, but you come up with some causal links about what happens in these sentences based on your prior knowledge of tripping up with drinks and so on. Okay. A point that I just want to remind you to remember, basically, is that you can make that inference about what's going on just through a few words. Glass of juice, tripped, and floor mop. And I'll come back to why I'm pointing that out later on in the talk. Okay. Now I want to just tell you a little bit about how we select good and poor comprehenders, because we do it in a fairly methodical and careful way by making sure that we get children who can read the words in the text. So the children that we select are poor comprehenders, not because they have word reading problems. Obviously, if children have word reading problems, they're not going to get very far with comprehension because they won't be able to read parts of the text. Okay, we want to exclude that group. And what we do is we give them typically a couple of assessments. This is just one passage, a fairly, I think it's the second or third level passage from the Neal analysis of reading ability. So the child reads the text, it's labour intensive, they read the text out loud to a tester, and if they misread words, then the tester corrects them. If they can't read words, the tester supplies the word for them. So by the end of the text, they have either read or had read to them, but it never gets to that point. There's a cut-off after a certain number of reading errors. But they have been able to read or been able to hear the words in the text. So when it comes to comprehension questions, we know that they have had all the text. It's all there and accessible for them. We also give them it's a vocabulary assessment, but it's a fairly crude vocabulary assessment adapted from the Gates and McGinnity. This is a version for younger children when they just have to pick the word that goes with the picture. This is a version for older children where they have to choose a synonym or word that's related to the word that's underlined. We use this not so much because it's a rough measure of vocabulary ability, but also because it ensures that children can actually read words without, there's no sounding out here. So they have to recognise the words and match them. So they know the meanings of words. They can't. It's not just that they can effectively decode words well. So typical groups. This is a group of 7-year-olds, 7 years 8 months, 7 years 9 months. Their word reading is what you would expect from their age. The poor comprehenders actually slightly better word reading than good comprehenders. But a huge difference in reading comprehension. So the good comprehenders are a bit above for their age. The poor comprehenders are below reading comprehension skill for their age. and then matched on this Gates and McGinnity word reading vocabulary task. Okay. And I just want to mention while I remember that poor comprehenders also have problems with listening comprehension. So this is not a specific, it's a specific comprehension problem, but it's not necessarily a specific reading comprehension problem. Now I just want to qualify that statement because these children do not have language disorders in the general sense. And when I say that they have problems with listening comprehension, what I mean is that they have problems with understanding texts if you read the text out loud to them. But we're talking about stories that are in kind of text language. So what we don't know when these children don't seem to have any problems with everyday communication is understanding text. Okay, so understanding text language, whether it's read to them or they read it themselves. Okay, back to integration and inference. So I'm just going to tell you briefly about one study that we did on integration and local and global inference skills in good and poor comprehenders. Okay, so we know that good and poor comprehenders differ in this local integration, bridging inferences, sometimes called, and they also have problems with what we're terming global coherence inferences, so like the inference about what was going on in the spilt juice text. Okay, so you need to make that the inference about what's happening to make the whole text connect up and coherent. In this study, we gave children, this is just a little bit of a story about two children, Michael and Debbie. And one of the questions about this, it was a longer text than this, one of the questions that refers to this bit was, where did Michael get the orange juice from? Okay, where did Michael get the orange juice from? His bag, thank you. Okay, so he got some drink out of his bag. The orange juice, definite reference, so you've got to connect the orange juice up with something. So the most likely bet is he got some orange juice out of his bag. Now this might seem a really trivial bridging inference, but poor comprehenders do have problems with this sort of thing. They have even more problems with global coherence inferences. So a bit of the same story, they're swimming costumes, sand castles, paddling here. So the question is, where did Debbie and Michael spend the afternoon? What do you reckon? At the beach, thank you. You're very, very thoughtful, thank you. So, how do you work that out? Well, and again, it's words in the text, and I'm emphasising this because I'm going to come back to this business of connecting up words later. So if you just read swimming costumes and water, just took notice of those, they could be in a swimming pool. Paddling, swimming costumes, well, it could be in a paddling pool. Just look at sand castles, maybe they're playing in a sand pit. Okay, so you really need to put a lot of these words together to connect up the information that they're at the beach or by the seaside. And that's why we call these global coherence inferences, because it's not just a local linking of words. You're really having to put lots of information together and use some background knowledge. In this case, it's pretty common, readily accessible background knowledge to understand the text as a whole. The other interesting thing about these sorts of inferences is that they're not signalled, and this is perhaps one of the reasons why children find them harder. So for the local inferences, there were, in the earlier example, there's pronouns. She, okay, who's she? You have to work that out. Her mum. The drink. What drink? There's no, there must have been a previous mention of drink. It's the definite reference drink, okay? But in these sorts of inferences, you've just got lots of clues, but there's nothing that kind of encourages you to make that inference from the text. There's no specific inference trigger. Okay, so good and poor comprehenders differ on both sorts of inferences, don't differ significantly on the literal questions, and if we actually partial out their literal understanding, they still differ on these sorts of inferences. And this is just one study out of many that we've done to show that poor comprehenders have inference problems. Okay, what is the link between inferences and comprehension? I'm going to skim, I just want to make this point because it's quite an important one. I'm going to skim over the evidence for the link because I've published papers that demonstrate a causal link. So just mention this briefly. Why is this important though? Well, we know that reading a lot is quite good for lots of things. Keith Stanovich wrote a very interesting and entertaining paper called Reading Makes You Smarter. And even if you're not a particularly good reader, if you read a lot, you get better at lots of things, including your IQ scores go up, vocabulary goes up. So it could be that children who read a lot, who are good comprehenders, just get better at inference making. It sort of drops out of their comprehension skill. And the reason it's important to know whether that's happening or whether inference making is fundamental and causal in reading comprehension is that if it's fundamental and causal, then it's a good training candidate, okay? But we don't want to waste time training things that just kind of drop out of being good at comprehension. A sort of trivial example, if someone's short and they've got small feet and we're worried about their feet size, we don't want to sort of start, doing feet elongation exercises. They will probably, if they're a child, they're going to get taller and their feet will get bigger. Okay? So we have to think carefully about causality before we start intervening with training programs. How can we tell? It's a tricky issue, this, and it's very likely that there's some causality and things are happening in both directions, but we want at least some evidence that inferences are causally implicated in reading comprehension. And we've got some from comprehension age match studies. I'm not going to mention those, but if anybody wants to know, I can refer you to publication. Longitudinal studies, I'll mention one briefly, and training studies. And of course, the idea behind training studies is that if there is a causal link, you train inference making, comprehension should get better because it's a causal factor, other things being equal. Okay, in the longitudinal study, we measured lots and lots of things, including inference skill, and some other processes that are important for comprehension, like comprehension monitoring and story structure understanding, which I'm not going to talk about much today. But note we had an inference skill measure. This was the pattern of relations in our final longitudinal model. One thing that's important to note is we included the autoregressor, so reading comprehension in the 3 age groups over 3, so these are the same children over 3 years. And these are the important predictors. So an inference and integration task was one of the significant predictors of reading comprehension at the final time point. And something else that's interesting to note is that vocabulary actually helped inference and integration skills across the first 2 time points. So because we've taken out reading code, so this is pretty tough design. We've taken out reading comprehension. We've also controlled for verbal ability and early vocabulary, and we still find that these skills are independent predictors of comprehension skill 2 or 3 years later. So that's one piece of evidence that these skills, including inference skills, are causally implicated in reading comprehension. That's just a summary of what I said. We've also got evidence that inference training improves comprehension skill. Just wanted to mention one study where we encourage children, it's not an old study now, but in fact some recent remediation work in the UK has built on this study. It's quite nice, nothing to do with me, some developed independently. So the general idea in our study was to get children more involved in their own comprehension, to get them to think about what was going on in the text, to think about individual words in the text, and to encourage inference making. And it worked. we showed that children who were trained in inference making and in a reciprocal teaching environment improved their comprehension scores on a standardised test. Okay, so that's just a quick skim through of the background really. What I want to get on to now is the role of inference in vocabulary acquisition and the converse, the role of vocabulary in inference skills. So I'm going to say something about those aspects. Now we know that written text is an important source of vocabulary learning once children become relatively fluent readers. So unlike in infancy, they're not being told, you know, this is a, and this is a, they are to some extent, but they couldn't possibly, I mean, the children's vocabulary progresses at such a phenomenal rate that they couldn't possibly learn all these new words just by being taught them. And there's good evidence that written text is a particularly good source of vocabulary development. So the more you read, the more your vocabulary flourishes. And what we think is that reading might provide instances to acquire and refine and consolidate, and I think you're probably all aware, I certainly am, that my vocabulary is still, I might kind of know a word in some sense, but my vocabulary is still developing because I might see that word in a slightly different context and realise that actually there's some subtleties of meaning that I hadn't quite appreciated. So we're constantly developing and consolidating our vocabulary through reading. And print is particularly good because, as you know, most people don't have everyday conversations in text language. If they do this expression in English, he talks like a book, which means that someone uses over formal spoken language. So written text provides more opportunities to learn more complex vocabulary items. And we have got some evidence that better comprehenders are better at inferring word meanings from text. So this is a study that I did with Kate Kane. Bit of introduction, and the word is actually a long word, of what. So the child is supposed to work out what they think a what might mean from the context. I'll just show you all of this, it's kind of hard to... So in a near condition, there was a clue. This is the clue here, these two sentences that came immediately after the what. In the far condition, this section came down here after the filler. Okay. So the clue is, Dad suggested taking a football, but that wasn't quite right. The football was too big to play fetch with, and it had lost its bounce. So, what's the what? Who's still awake? Thank you. A little ball, yeah. It might have some other attributes as well as being little. A little bouncy ball. Thank you. Excellent. Right. And so what you've done is you've inferred from the context that the football's too big, so it's smaller than the football, and the football has lost its bounce, so she wants something bouncy. So what she's looking for is a little bouncy ball. Okay, so we did this series of these sorts of passages on vocabulary inferences with good and poor comprehenders. Sorry, there was an ending time. And what we found was that the poor comprehenders were significantly worse, but only in the distant conditions. So if they had to integrate information, they couldn't make these inferences if the clues were right there up with the unknown word. But if they had to integrate information over a longer section of text, then they have more problems, the good comprehenders. And this might be related to working memory problems. That's another area I'm not going to go into today, but we know that poor comprehenders tend to have poor working memories. But this does not seem to be a primary causal factor in their comprehension. We had working memory, if you noticed, in the longitudinal study, and it didn't come out in competition with the other variables. It was not a significant predictor. It's correlated with comprehension. Okay, I also wanted to say a little bit about vocabulary development progress across time. So this was some data from our longitudinal study, and we noticed these are actually the same children at 8 years and 11 years, so 3 years later. This is the raw vocabulary score. Sorry about the slightly confusing graph. They don't actually get worse at vocabulary. These are raw scores on Gates McGinnity, and they have a harder version when they're 11 years old. We can't use age-related scores because we don't have any UK norms. Okay. But what we see is that the poor comprehenders are actually pretty similar. They were matched on both. There's no significant differences in vocabulary when they were 8 years old. But over time, the good and poor comprehenders become differentiated in their vocabulary scores. So it seems like being a good comprehender at an earlier age is predictive of better vocabulary at a later age. And we looked at some of the variables that might be contributing to this effect. This is again our longitudinal data. There's 2 spots for each year group. This is from 11 years up to 16 years old. Bear with me because you'll find out why this is duplicated in a minute. So non-verbal IQ predicts a very small amount of variance in vocabulary in all age groups. Earlier vocabulary at age 8, this is more or less what you saw from the last slide, but in a different sort of analysis. Vocabulary at age 8 predicts quite a bit, more than 10% of variance in vocabulary at age 11, and still a bit in later years, even up to 16 years. But what was particularly interesting was that early comprehension was an even better predictor. So it's a significant predictor, early vocabulary is a significant predictor, take that back. Early comprehension is a significant predictor of later vocabulary, even after all this time. So this is over from 8 years to 16 years. And over and above earlier vocabulary. If we look separately, comprehension and reading habits were correlated, and they don't predict independent variance, but if we look at reading habits, an even stronger predictor of later vocabulary. So this is reading habits at age 8, predicting this proportion of variance 8 years later on. So it seems that reading comprehension is important in vocabulary development, probably through this thoughtful reading and inference making, at least in part. And certainly reading habits are important in vocabulary development, as lots of other people have shown. Lots of reading is good for vocabulary. Okay, so just a brief summary of what we know so far about vocabulary learning. Poor comprehenders aren't so good at it. Even if you deliberately ask them to work out what a word means, they're not as good at it as good comprehenders, particularly in this high integration text. Comprehension seems to influence vocabulary growth. Probably, we don't know this, but probably through reading experience. So good comprehenders are likely, in fact we know that they do more voluntary reading at home from an early age. So probably through reading experience they are developing their vocabulary. So this is a sort of Matthew effect in vocabulary, if that means anything to you. So the kids if they're rich in comprehension, they're getting richer at vocabulary and to some extent comprehension, of course. Okay, now I'm going to come back to the issue of how vocabulary, we've talked about how inferences might support vocabulary through perhaps doing a lot of reading. I'm going to come back to the issue of how vocabulary might support inference making, to the converse. Okay, so recently, the standard vocabulary measures that we used and the Gates and McGinnity are fairly sort of trivial vocabulary assessments, in that what they're measuring is typically whether you can pick a synonym, whether you can match a word with a picture. And you could probably do those sorts of tasks without knowing much about the words. Okay, so if you have some knowledge, you can do this matching, but you don't have to know a lot about the words. And what's been happening more recently is people have started to make this distinction between breadth of vocabulary, broadly how many words you know, and depth of vocabulary, which is what you know about those words. And an important aspect of that is not just the concept that the word is a part of, but how it relates to other vocabulary items. So these guys, independently, but they published pretty much simultaneously, Uyet and Tannenbaum and colleagues made this distinction, I've already mentioned, and they showed that the depth measures, and I'll come back to what this means in a bit more detail in a minute, were predictive of comprehension skill over and above the breadth measures. So there seems to be some independence between these measures of vocabulary, although they are correlated with each other. And we've found that depth of vocabulary is related to making global coherence inferences. And I'm going to explain why this might be happening. Just bear that fact in mind. I'm going to explain what might be going on here in more detail. Okay, a bit more audience participation to illustrate depth of vocabulary. What do you know about a platypus? Any offers? Yes, an eager person over there.
It lives in Australia.
Yeah.
Queensland. Lives in the water. It can lay eggs. It's a mammal.
Okay. Yeah. It's. I'll repeat that because many of you probably didn't hear. So, a platypus. They're native to Australia. They're mammals, but they can lay eggs. Now that's a bit weird, isn't it? An egg-laying mammal. There's one other I found out only recently. You know what that is?
Yeah, the echidna.
Excellent, yeah. Yes. There's one other interesting fact about platypus. Anybody? This is a platypus, for anybody who doesn't know. Something that people often say is, oh, it's got a duck bill. Okay. So it's furry, so it looks pretty much like a kind of unusual mammal, okay? It's warm-blooded. And it's a mammal because it lactates, so it feeds its young milk. But weirdly for a mammal, it lays eggs. Okay. There's another fact about the platypus that some of you might know. It's the only venomous mammal. So in some ways it has some things in common, so you probably can't see this very well, but in some ways it's a bit like reptiles because it's venomous, in some ways it's a bit like birds because it lays eggs, and mammals because it lactates and it's furry and so on. Okay, so just to follow up a little bit on that example, if you know lots about a platypus, well, actually if you know nothing about a platypus, you might know it's an animal, nothing more. And you read something like the platypus was curled protectively around the eggs, then you might assume that those are the platypus's eggs. If you know a little bit about a platypus, that it's a mammal, you might think, oh, eggs. Well, maybe it's got some eggs and it's going to eat them later, so it's protecting them until it gets hungry. So this is its this is its bounty, and it wants to keep them for later. If you know lots about the platypus, then you would probably make the inference that actually, like the naive person, these are the platypus's eggs. So just this depth of knowledge about the platypus can lead you to different interpretations of a sentence about a platypus and eggs. Okay, I'm going to build on that idea a little bit. So, as I said, these ideas relate to Chuck Perfetti's lexical quality hypothesis, and broadly what he argues is that if you have a low quality lexical code, then and you have to retrieve that with effort, then that can interfere with comprehension processes that require a high quality code. The Lexical quality hypothesis covers a wide range of different sorts of coding, phonological codes, orthographic codes, grammar, but also meaning. So it's particularly the last aspect that I'm focusing on here. The relation between the quality of the meaning code, or your depth of vocabulary, and comprehension skill. So what we're arguing is that one aspect that might be crucially important in comprehension skill via inference making is that if you have lots of rich vocabulary and you make these associative links between words, then that's going to support comprehension, because many inferences will just sort of drop out of those associations. If you think back to the little text about the beach, if you just pulled out those words, paddling, swimming costume, sand castles, pier, something else, and I just gave you those words, you could say what connects those is beach. Okay. So it seems like this breadth of vocabulary, these associative links between vocabulary items could be important in supporting inference making. Okay, I think I've said that. In particular, it's the depth that's likely to be more important for the breadth, and Perfetti has actually produced some studies in adults showing that activation of semantic networks will help them underpin certain inferences. We've done some preliminary work with children based on this hypothesis. I think I've more or less explained this. We think that this will happen because text connecting and particularly the global coherence inferences are often dependent on these associative links between the text. Right, last bit of audience participation to, I hope, illustrate this. I'm not sure if this is going to work in, I know there's a lot of non-native English speakers here, but let's give it a go. You might know this paradigm. Okay, so you're going to read these words once and you have to try and memorise them without writing them down. Okay, I'll read them through once just to make sure that everybody's had a chance to read them or hear them. So the words in the first list are bed, rest, tired, dream, wake, snooze, blanket, doze, slumber, snore, nap, peace, yawn, drowsy. Second list, door, glass, pane, shade, ledge, sill, house, open, curtain, frame, view, breeze, sash, screen, shutter. Okay, hope you've remembered them all. Right, no conferring. I want you to write down which of those words you actually just saw or had read to you. No. Calling out, please. I'll ask you in a minute. Okay, you've had enough time. So, recognition test. Who saw these underlined words? Who saw sleep? A few people, yeah, okay. And who saw window? Yeah, quite a lot of people. Okay, good. All right, you didn't actually see either of those words. There's no sleep and there's no window. This is the D. Schroeder McDermott, the DRM forced memory paradigm. What's happening here then? Just think about why do some people think that they've read sleep, and why do some people think they've read window? Okay, because those words are the kind of overarching themes that connect up these words, sleep, and these words, window. So these are all, most of them, you might not make all exactly the same associations, but lots of these words at least relate to sleep, and lots of these words relate to window. So you tend to get misled, and this is an instance of where this inferential processing might actually be harmful. So you've got a misrepresentation of what you actually read. And adults do this quite a lot. Young children, actually, very young children, like 4-year-olds, are not so easily misled, but there is a developmental trend. And we've actually done a study on good and poor comprehenders using this paradigm, which is published. And we did exactly what I've just done with you. We got good and poor comprehenders to memorise a short list. The vocabulary, they were shorter than what I've just shown you, had sort of more constrained vocabulary for children. And then we asked them to recall or recognise words from those lists, including a theme word which they hadn't actually seen. And what was really nice was that the poor comprehenders are actually making more errors on this task. So they're more likely to falsely claim that they have read these theme words or to recognise them in error. So we take this as an indication. It's quite nice when poor comprehenders actually do worse on something than good comprehenders. That's right. So we take this as an indication that what's going on is probably that the good comprehenders they're not asked to derive a theme, of course, they're just asked to remember the word list, as you were. So it seems like they might be derived automatically, it's not required, making these connections and being misled by these associative links between the words into believing that they've read something that they actually haven't. Okay, so this is what we think might be going on there. And just another example of how this might work. So if you're reading this short text, there's lots of words: trolley, tills, packets, buying, aisle, don't know about treats, but tills, scan, prices, packing bags. And you don't really have to read the text. If you just look at these words, it's pretty obvious that this text is taking place in the supermarket. So you've got immediately from those words a framework or a theme for your text. I'm not saying this is what all the inference making is about. What I'm arguing is that an important aspect of inference making is very likely to be this ability to form these associative links. Okay. And again, the important thing is that no single word or word pairs are going to tell you exactly where this is happening. You need to connect up quite a lot of the words to get this global coherence inference. We also have evidence that from another study that I'm not going to tell you about in any detail, I just wanted to mention briefly, that it's not just knowledge of word meanings that poor comprehenders seem to be deficient in. What we did in another study was we gave them a task where they had to judge synonyms or hyponyms like rain, weather. You know, is rain a type of weather? Is a dog a type of animal? And we measured their accuracy in doing that, and their response times, and their general response times, and their response times to do that task. And we found that over and above that accuracy, that wasn't a very important predictor of comprehension skill. It was the speed with which they could make these judgments that was crucial. And so it's not so much that the poor comprehenders don't have, I think they don't have as much depth of knowledge, but even when they do, it's the speed with which they can activate this that seems to be important in comprehension. And that makes a lot of sense because particularly listening comprehension, even reading comprehension, you know, is something that you've got to do under speeded conditions. If you're reading and thinking about each word very carefully, you know, you've lost the meaning of the previous sentence, and the text has disappeared into oblivion. So it's important that these concepts are activated rapidly and automatically. So we are planning to do some more work in this area, and this, as I say, is only one of the areas where we're now really trying to make these connections between the different components of comprehension. I think it's been very important to distinguish the sorts of processes that are important for comprehension skills so as we can think more clearly about those. But it's also important to think about how these processes might be interdependent and influence each other in development. Okay, so I'll finish with some conclusions and suggestions and general thoughts. Right, so I think we've pretty clearly established that poor comprehenders have problems with inferences. So I only really showed you one study, but there's plenty more. Not just from my group, but other people that across the world have shown this. We have evidence that this relation is causal, so that inference making in some form or other might be a good candidate for training. Right, I didn't say anything much about this. It seems that difficulties with inference don't seem to be necessarily to do with knowledge in itself. So in the short text that I showed you about the seaside, we actually asked children where they thought children would be, if they were paddling or if they were swimming, building sandcastles, and they know this stuff. They can produce it if they're asked. But what we are now thinking about, and of course vocabulary is an aspect of knowledge, is that it's not just having the knowledge, but it's having a profound knowledge and making these rapid associations that could be important. So for instance, going back briefly to the ice cream van text, you might know perfectly well what an ice cream van looks like from childhood, and you can maybe draw an ice cream van or describe it. But just because you know what it is doesn't mean that you automatically evoke this information you might know it too, but you might evoke the information that ice cream vans are a transitory phenomenon in an area. They come and go. Okay? So that's the sort of distinction that we're trying to make between having the knowledge and having the depth of knowledge and associative links. We are getting evidence that inferences skills not only affect comprehension and affect vocabulary learning, but they also they not only affect comprehension skill, but also influence vocabulary learning, probably through inferential processes, and vocabulary seems to be supporting, at least depth of vocabulary seems to support comprehension and inference skills. So a few educational implications. The first point doesn't really derive directly from my talk, but it's something that I really firmly believe that comprehension skills need to be taught. For some children, they don't just drop out of their language skills and learning the words. And this is an important point because actually teachers don't pick up on children who have comprehension skills. If we ask them, we've tried this, because it's very time demanding to actually assess every child on their individually and their comprehension. So we tried to get teachers to say, well, who do you think are the poor comprehenders, and explain to them what that meant. And they pick out poor readers. So they're not really aware of these children. And this could be a big issue later on, because once children, and there is in the US talk about the 4th grade slump, once children start moving from learning to read to reading to learn, reading becomes a whole lot more demanding, and if they haven't got those skills in place, they're going to be in trouble, and there's evidence that there is. And I've heard teachers in the UK say recently, I asked them what they do to help children's comprehension in junior school classes, so sort of 7, 8-year-olds upwards, and they say, oh, it's really important. We don't do much on comprehension yet because it's really important to, get their word reading fluent first. And I just think that's so misguided. We really need to be working on both these things at the same time through oral language, storytelling, and all sorts of things that will support later comprehension. Okay, so that's a bit of a hobby horse of mine, but okay, but what does follow more directly is that training in skills that encourage poorer readers, poorer comprehenders to make inferences is helpful, and this could even be making inferences from single words. What do you think is going on here? Like I asked, is Mary a child or a woman? Why do you think this? And so on. So you can get an awful lot out of the text, even at that level. Children should be encouraged to develop their vocabulary. If they don't know terms in a text, and again I've seen this in classrooms recently, they're trained to go to find a dictionary. But what I would argue is that they're actually going to get much more out of the learning if they can be encouraged to try and work out, have some hypotheses about what words mean from the text. Because, you know, you're not always going to have a dictionary handy, and it's very time-consuming keeping going looking up words. So I think encouraging children to work out words using their inference skills is a good strategy. I've focused on depth of vocabulary knowledge, so it's important, we believe, to develop rich vocabulary that children can then activate. So not an additional issue is that teaching children, there's lots of evidence that teaching children vocabulary is not very effective. What you need to do is give them vocabulary in rich context and help them to think about what these words mean. Again, to work it out and connect it up. Just teaching them definitions is pretty much useless. They forget them the next day. Okay, I think. Oh yes, and the last thing I wanted to say was about, as I say, I've talked mostly about these connections between inference and vocabulary, but of course there's lots of other skills that are important. We've got evidence that these other skills, cohesive times, text structure, understanding, comprehension, monitoring, are all important to comprehension. And I think what I put in here are just some arrows about possible links, but I think it would be great to have more evidence of the sort that we're gathering for inference-making vocabulary links to see how these things tie up and interact with each other to support comprehension. Ah yes, you forgot about this. Lovely quote from Kostas Konstantinou in his presidential address. He was talking about science education, and he said, I scribbled it down on the back of a receipt, so I hope this is an accurate rendition, but it was very, very much like this. Teachers are looking for solutions to implement, preferably in a foolproof manner. And he was talking about science education, but I think exactly the same thing is going on in teaching reading. Teachers they're terribly, terribly busy. They want they want to know what to do. Where's the lesson plan? Where's the materials? What do I do to make these children better comprehenders? But actually, I don't think there are any easy solutions, despite the demand for them. Teaching comprehension is not easy. We haven't got this one-size-fits-all sort of solution. And I think what we need to be careful to do, and I say this again because I've observed it recently, today we're going to have a lesson on inference skills, or today we're going to have a lesson on characters' emotions. That is not the way to teach comprehension. The way to teach it is to know a lot about the processes, have a really good understanding about what comprehension is about, and then to teach it sensitively with interesting, challenging texts that can be discussed. And lots of oral language, I think lots of comprehension training need not involve any reading. So what we don't want to do is teach these as isolated things. We need to understand the interactions, and I think it's crucially important that teachers have knowledge of the comprehension processes so that they can teach flexibly and help these children to develop the skills that they need basically to work things out for themselves, to become more involved in the text and to become better comprehenders. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for this talk. It's very lovely also with the audience participation. I have like two questions. The first one is you focused very much on text comprehension, but I was constantly wondering whether some of the things that you presented also relate to comprehension of maybe spoken language, and also you talk about the inference problems. Whether these also in the children who have these problems also appear in other cognitive tasks like cognitive. Like math tasks, and they have problems doing inferences there. And my second question was that you talk about inferences, and with a lot of the things you mentioned, I had a feeling. Maybe it's just another word for it, but I had also a feeling that maybe these people are also having problems with imagining things, imagination troubles. Is this the same concept? Is that only in a scientific way, or you could comment on that? Thank you very much.
All right, first question first, which I think there were actually 3 questions. The first one that I remember was, is this really a text comprehension problem or an oral language comprehension problem? And I did say something briefly about that. Certainly, if we read texts out to children, they have the same sorts of problems with comprehension as if they read them themselves. But what I want to emphasise there is this is about reading texts out loud, listening to texts that are designed to be read. Okay, so they have all the qualities of written texts. So children who have comprehension problems with written texts have problems even if you read those texts out to them. But they don't seem to have problems with everyday interactions. Okay, so it is more general than reading, yes. I know your third question was about imagining. What was your second question? Sorry.
Whether they have also trouble with maths.
Oh yes, whether it's a general inference problem, yes. We've had some limited success actually. I have made some attempts, but they haven't been very rewarding, so it's been a bit sporadic, looking to see whether these poor comprehenders also have problems with tasks that have nothing to do with reading or language, like embedded figures tasks. I don't know if you know that. It's a kind of can't see the wood for the trees sort of task, and what we would expect is that poor comprehenders focus on details. It's something that autistic children have a lot of problems with, so they focus on the details and they don't see, there might be a kind of roof that has a trapezoid shape or something, and they're supposed to pick out the trapezoid shape, but they just focus on all the other information and they're worse at doing that. Autistic children. We don't find evidence that poor comprehenders are poor on that sort of task. And there's some, we did actually include some maths tasks in the longitudinal study, and there was some weak evidence that comprehension was related, but it wasn't really. I mean, maybe we used the wrong sort of maths tasks that didn't require sufficient inference making, but they weren't just kind of mechanical tasks, they were more problem solving tasks. But I know that in some other areas like verbal arithmetic problems that at least one person has worked on those, reading comprehension is actually a very good predictor of performance in those. But then, of course, you've got to read and construct a mental representation of what the situation is about. You know, things like, you know, Tom had 3 marbles and John had 6 marbles. How many more marbles did John have? How many more marbles did John have than Tom? Something like that. Okay, so there's a big working memory load, and you've got to construct the representation, so it's not surprising that that's with text comprehension. So a bit of a mixed picture there. Imagining things, that's very interesting because I've got a PhD student who's been doing some work on this recently, and she kind of included an imagery questionnaire. She's been doing some work on externalization using pictures to support comprehension, so sort of external representation of text. And she actually asked the children about whether they imagined, and she had a sort of scale from, you know, vague images to detailed images to, I can't remember the details, but you know, moving images. And she found actually that the better comprehenders scored higher on those, that there was quite a strong correlation between their comprehension skill and scores on this imagery task. So it could, and imagery too, I didn't mention that, imagery does support, if you train children in imagery skills, we've done some work to show that it does support their comprehension as other aids do, like externalising the text and effectively building a representation. So yeah, there do seem to be some links, but whether, what's the chicken and what's the egg, we don't know. Whether better comprehenders develop better imagery skills because of their greater experience, or whether imagery skills, I mean, what would be nice would be to look at children's imagery skills when they're quite young, but that's difficult because young children typically don't really have the metacognitive skills to report on imagery, I think. But yeah, interesting links there. Thank you. Interesting questions.
Also thank you very much for this lovely talk. And I've also got two questions. One was related to global cohesion, and I think it was quite easy to see how, for instance, the ice cream van is an image that's easily evoked among sort of Europeans sitting here. But if you come, for instance, from another country, maybe from Africa, you speak another language, then it's a difficult image to evoke, and so you would have difficulties understanding. Now, I wonder, what's the evidence that sort of speaking a second language or doing tasks in a second language impedes sort of the global cohesion skills, or are there no differences between monolingual and bilingual children, for instance, on these kind of tasks?
Frankly, I have no idea because we've only looked at, I'm sure there have been some bilingual children in our samples, but we exclude children who don't speak fluent English, at least. But yeah, I mean, clearly there's the knowledge issue, of course, and that's clearly going to be a problem. There's some old work showing that cultural context is very important for understanding. And can be misleading as well, of course. If you know too much about a subject, you can jump to all sorts of unwarranted conclusions. Oh yes, I mean, what I would predict is that if you're reading something in a language in which you're not entirely fluent, then going back to Buffetti's lexical quality hypothesis, if you're having trouble actually reading some of the words, or you're not quite sure of the meanings of the words, that's going to create, I mean, Buffetti's earlier idea, which I think still applies, is that there was a sort of bottleneck. You'll spend more effort working out what the words mean and at the sentence level, and you'll lose the gist of the text as a whole. So I haven't done any work on bilinguals comprehension, but my prediction would be that they're going to have problems that are entirely consistent with lexical quality. At all levels, probably the phonological, orthographic, grammatical, and meaning level. Yeah.
Okay, a short question. You did not, if I am right, you did not mention the word IQ or verbal IQ in your talk. Yeah. What is your theoretical position, and how do you address IQ in your empirical research?
Yeah, I did mention IQ in the, we had some measures of non-verbal IQ, but more importantly in the longitudinal study, we had measures of verbal IQ and non-verbal IQ, and maybe you missed it, but there was a little box that said, I don't know, it's verbal IQ or verbal ability. Yeah, it's predictive, but really it's correlated with reading comprehension. It predicted reading comprehension in our longitudinal model, but it's not all there is to reading comprehension. So over and above the contributions of verbal IQ, we get predictive power from inference making and these other skills that I mentioned briefly, comprehension, monitoring and structure. And moreover, we can actually we can match children. We haven't always done that because it's just something, but in the early studies we match children for verbal IQ. So it is correlated with comprehension, of course. You know, it would be very odd if it weren't, but it's not. It doesn't kind of encompass everything else. And just one additional thing, what we tended to find is where there are IQ differences, the poor comprehenders' IQs tend to hover around average. It's the good comprehenders who have slightly better IQs. So again, it doesn't seem to be an explanatory factor, because from their IQs you'd expect them to have pretty average reading comprehension, and they haven't. So there's some discrepancy there. Hello.
Hello. Again, thanks for your very nice talk. I have a bit of a practical research question actually, because I'm not a reading researcher, but I do try to measure sometimes comprehension of the learning materials. And the issue is always there that, okay, so I want to measure what they had comprehended while studying the learning material, so then I ask questions. And sometimes I really think, sometimes I'm more or less measuring whether they had understood the question itself rather than the learning material. So how do you, in your experience, deal with this issue? How do you design questions or test comprehension of the material itself rather than the questions?
Yeah, well, I think, particularly with comprehension tests, that's an issue, and we don't design the tests. But in our own materials, I think that the questions that I showed you were fairly representative of the sorts of questions that we would ask. So I would, where were Debbie and Michael in this story? So they're not kind of complicated, convoluted questions. So, but it is an issue. But we do have texts that vary in complexity, but the questions are typically quite straightforward, grammatically simple. Don't bring in extra vocabulary items and so on. So I think that it is an issue. I think that's. I thought what you were going to ask. Actually, another issue is when you ask the questions, you can often get the inferences made at the time. Yeah. So it's very, very difficult to discriminate between what's been actually represented and understood at the time of reading the text and what happens kind of in the panic situation where you're actually asked a question about it and you have to try to, in a long text you're not going to be able to retrieve the answer, but sometimes in short stories you might be able to sort of rethink them a bit and come up with an answer. But no, I think it's an issue, and good luck, and keep the questions as short as possible.
Perhaps a related point, you could also train children to make inferences during reading, but you could also train them how to use questions to make these inferences, because that's, of course, that's what questions do, right? Good comprehenders, just when they get the question, they're like, okay, the first question is, okay, what inference are you?
Yeah, and that's what we did in the training side that I mentioned. It was kind of reciprocal teaching, and one aspect of that was asking quite demanding questions. And I've seen this recently actually in a classroom where the teacher had groups of children, and they had to come up with questions about the text that they just read. And then in the group they had discussions about what the answers to these questions were and justified their answers. And then they talked to other groups about what that group had decided the answer was. So I think that's very, very valuable, yes, working from questions, and in particular getting children to generate questions and challenge other children and come to some hopeful consensus about what an answer might be, or agree to disagree. Yeah.
I wish to thank Jane Oakhill for this inspiring talk. It's time to close this session now. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. And wish to thank you once more for this.
things.